Hello, it's me again, Dexter Van Zyl. First of all, I want to thank everybody for watching yesterday's TikTok video and for sharing it. It got more than 700 views, which I think is pretty good for a first-time TikTok that was basically done on the fly. Today, I'm going to speak briefly about what it's going to be like for Jews returning to college campuses this fall. Some students, freshmen, may already be back for orientation. Now, this is directed at American Jews and their parents also, but more specifically at Christians in the United States who care about the safety of the Jewish people. I want to give some context. Basically, we're still dealing with the aftermath of the October 7th massacre. The October 7th massacre was an attempt to restore the social order that existed in the Middle East prior to the creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Historically, and when Israel was created, it knocked the teeth out of a long-term system of oppression and mistreatment imposed on Jews and Christians throughout the Middle East and Muslim-majority countries, and also other religious groups throughout the world in the Middle East and South Asia. The dhimmi system that I'm talking about was was imposed on Jews and Christians as Islamic rulers dominated the region. When Muslim rulers conquered territories, non-Muslims had three choices. They could be killed, they could convert to Islam, or they could accept subordinate status under Muslim rule. And even when they were initially minorities after they were conquered, Christians and Jews became subordinate to Muslim rulers and to the Muslim population. And that's one of the factors of why the Islamic population grew so much in Muslim conquered countries. A whole system of rules was designed to demonstrate this submission and impose it onto non-Muslims. Christians were not allowed to ring the bells at their churches. Jews and Christians had to wear special clothing to designate themselves as non-Muslims. And if they were walking on the road, for example, they had to give way to Muslims. And as Mark Dury has explained in his book, The Third Choice, Islam, Dhimmitude, and Freedom, there was a ritual associated with the paying of the jizya, which was a tax that they had to pay for their very lives. And the ritual surrounding this, the Muslim rulers would ritualistically strike the neck of dhimmis with a blade who paid the tax to remind them that they were paying a ransom for their very lives. Under the system of dhimmitude, whenever Christians and Jews agitated for equality and freedom in Muslim-majority countries, it made them legitimate targets for violence and renewed jihad. And we've been highlighting this reality at the Middle East Forum's Dhimmitude project. For the past several months, I've been editing and posting articles written by scholars about dhimmitude in the modern era. And it's very important. I hope you can actually go and read some of those articles. Now, one of the things that I've learned from Mark Dury is that the word dhimmi, which was derived from dhimma, which was the pact that was imposed on non-Muslims, it was essentially a treaty of obligation. People have used the phrase treaty of protection. It was a treaty of obligation that was imposed on non-Muslims. And it was the word dhimma was derived from the word dham, Dhamm, the Arabic word for blameworthy. And what happened is that there was a notion that the people who refused to accept Islam made themselves or rendered themselves blameworthy in one way or another. And this system was formalized in the Pact of Umar imposed on non-Muslims by an early Islamic leader. Now, non-Muslims were not allowed to read the Quran or criticize Islam. And interestingly enough, in the modern era, the whole notion of Islamophobia, I think, is a recapitulation of this aspect of the Dhimma Pact. Non-Muslims really don't have any right in the ideology of Islamism or in the minds of many Muslims to say anything critical of Islam, which is one of the reasons why we have such difficulties associated with free speech when people criticize Islam. And particularly in the United Kingdom, where essentially the leaders there are afraid of they're more afraid of Muslims than they are and Islamist leaders than they are of their own people, so to speak, who were born there. Now, this dhimmi system was formalized under the Pact of Omar, and the thing is that it's had a huge historical consequence. In the late 1800s, when Christians in the Anatolian Peninsula, which is now known as the modern state of Turkey, started to advocate for their rights, freedom, and equality in Muslim majority environments, largely as a consequence of support they got from European rulers, that made Muslims in the Anatolian Peninsula very angry because it basically undermined the feelings of superiority that they had over Christians. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is that uh, to a certain extent, it was like, yes, our economy isn't doing very well. We're kind of poor, but at least we are superior to the Christians. And that was one of the reasons why the Young Turks were able to essentially enlist the help of so many Muslims in the murder of Christians during the Armenian genocide. Now, one of the things that we have to understand is that the Armenian genocide was one of three genocides, so to speak. It was described as the 30-year genocide in a book by Benny Morris and another writer. Between 1895 and 1925, we're looking at about 2.5 million Christians were murdered. Assyrian, Armenian, and Greek Christians, and they were killed largely because they were seen as threats to the modern state of Turkey that was being established by Ataturk. But it was Islamist hostility or historical hostility towards Islamic hostility towards Christians that was used to basically bring about the violence against those Christians. And that's one of the reasons why, if you hear me give interviews, I say regularly that Islamism, uh, which I refer to it as an ideology of Muslim male supremacism. Islamism is an attempt to restore the system of dominance of Muslims over non-Muslims and expand it into Western democracies. And those who promote Islamist ideologies promote male dominance over women, both inside and outside their communities, and an attitude of superiority over non-Muslims. And that's one of the things that's made me so unhappy with folks on the left, the red section of the Red-Green Alliance, because ultimately what they have done is rewarded an attitude of Muslim male supremacism. And we see this attitude or ideology manifest itself wherever Muslims gather in large numbers or form autonomous communities in Western democracies. Okay, and it's one of the reasons why we see a lack of safety for women and non-Muslims in many areas throughout Europe. Now, Daniel Pipes, the founder of the Middle East Forum, has written extensively about some of the impulses that are evident in historical Islam. One of them is legalism, and the other one is autonomism, or this desire for autonomy. Ultimately, Muslims, wherever they live, they have to be in charge. It's not like they have a tradition of separation between mosque and state. And to be sure, many Muslims are interested in essentially changing that. Mustafa Akyol, for example, has written about it and said that there is no compulsion in religion, and we need to basically, make that a reality within the modern world. And the thing is that Danny Bermawi has warned, and he has written a book about Islam, Israel, and the West. And I've heard him speak, and one of the things he has said is that wherever Muslims gather in large numbers and predominate in a geographic area in a Western democracy, they may eventually push for some form of separation or independence, and that those areas could become bases of support for Islamist expansionism and hostility towards the West, and it will be an internal threat to those democracies. And I think, given what we see in Europe, I think that that's a legitimate concern to raise. But I want to get back to October 7th. I want you to think of it as the modern equivalent of what white Southerners tried to do after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. White Southerners were humiliated by their loss of dominant status over black slaves, and they were deeply unhappy with the presence of free black people. The Republicans basically put blacks in positions of power throughout the American South. And eventually what happened is that the white supremacists and the white Southerners were able to bring that to an end. and they wanted to, and they did that in an attempt to restore some form of servitude. And to a significant extent, they succeeded through race riots and lynchings in places like Wilmington and Atlanta. And one of the things is in the early 1900s, they made a movie celebrating their success. It was called Birth of a Nation. And if you ask me, this is a historically well-known movie that it was basically scandalous. It was banned in Boston, I think, eventually. Uh, but the whole point was to basically kind of legitimize the restoration of white supremacism over blacks in the American South. And it took about 100 years in the mid 1960s for the civil rights movement to really start to really confront this whole system. The thing is that Birth of a Nation basically gave a narrative in which white Southerners were portrayed as brutally oppressed and not able to basically, live their lives properly because of what happened as a result of the Civil War. And the thing is that in many respects, that narrative has basically been embraced by Muslim extremists and Islamists in the Middle East and in Western democracies as well. And one of the things that they will say is well, everything was fine between Christians and Muslims prior to Israel's creation in 1948. And it was those darn Christian Zionists that have made us all hate Christians in the Middle East. When in fact there has been ongoing hostility towards Christians in Muslim majority environments in the Middle East for a very, very long time. And it predated Israel's creation for centuries. Okay. And the thing is that this is similar to essentially the lost cause narrative, or and I'm going to forgive the phrase, but the happy darky narrative that was put forth by former American slave owners and their descendants in the American South. Everything was fine before the North came into the American South and freed the slaves. Everything was fine. And the slaves, really, they were actually very happy. And that's just not true. And the thing is that we see a similar rhetoric and ideology in the Middle East today. And I've seen people talk about it. Even the Christians in the West Bank at Christ at the Checkpoint conferences would offer this narrative. They would say, yeah, everything was fine before the Jews got their state. And so this brings us back to the issue of Jews returning to college campuses in the aftermath of October 7th. It's 3 years on. In the aftermath of October 7th, what we saw was leftist organizations, groups like Students for Justice in Palestine and Palestinian Youth Movement, and more recently the Democratic Socialists of America, working to basically drive Jews into the dark corners of campus life. Okay. And it was a terrifying process for many of them. You would hear stories of Jews not wanting to leave their dorm rooms after October 7th because of the protests that were taking place on the quads. If you showed any signs of Jewish identity, okay, you would get mobbed. And the thing is that what has happened is that it began within days of the October 7th massacre and intensified throughout 2024. And in some cases, it involved physical assault. Jews were demonized. And there was one voice that basically Jews need to be careful because of the hostility that they have caused as a result of what Israel has done in Gaza. And the false accusation of genocide against Israel is the new allegation that portrays Jews as blameworthy. Remember that word. I used that word previously. To portray Jews as blameworthy and worthy of contempt and worthy targets of subordination. And it's a different narrative than the one leveled at Christians and Jews under the historical dhimmi system, but it has the same effect. It renders Jews and those who support Israel legitimate targets for hostility and subordination and to be driven off of college campuses. This is the environment that American Jews are heading back into when they return to classes this September. These leftist groups have broadcast a narrative that legitimizes shoving Jews into the shadows, making them afraid to go out into the quads, into the libraries or the cafeterias. And unfortunately, historically, the administrators have done a very poor job of stopping it. And to young Jews who are returning to college campuses, it's unfair. It's unfair what's happening to you, because ultimately the burdens of protecting and maintaining Western civilization are falling on your shoulders to an unfair. You are targets of a failing civilization, or people who are trying to bring about the failure of that civilization. And the thing, and you're going to have to stand up to it, and you're going to have to find leaders on campuses who will basically give you, and encourage you to be the courageous young people that you need to be in order to stand up to it. And for those Christians who are on college campuses who know better and know about what's going on, it's your obligation to essentially stand in solidarity with them, and it's your obligation to make sure that this doesn't happen. And the thing is that one of the things that you're going to have to deal with is that this modern system of dhimmitude, or neo-dhimmitude, is being imposed with the help of people on the left who portray themselves as champions of equality and freedom. In practice, they are helping to establish conditions in which the ideology of Muslim male supremacism can advance. And so this is especially a message to the Christians I know. Do everything you can to help broadcast this video and encourage everyone you know to pray for the safety and welfare of Jews on college campuses this fall. And instruct people as best you can about the reality of dhimmitude and the ideology of Muslim male supremacism as it manifests itself in the modern world. And as followers of Christ, you are equipped to stand up to it. Okay, I want to make that this is me speaking as a Christian. Now, if you want to educate yourself about dhimmitude, there's a couple of books, and I'm going to show them to you on the screen. The first one is Islam and Dhimmitude by Bat-Yor, Where Civilizations Collide. And the other one is The Decline of Eastern Christianity Under Islam, From Jihad to Dhimmitude. And I would show you a copy of the book I mentioned previously, Mark Dury's Third Choice, but I've given all my copies away. And I only have it on Kindle, but if you don't want to read the long books, read Mark Dury's books. Now, one last point, and it's about the whole genocide accusation. Hamas murdered civilians on October 7th, and it deliberately targeted them. We all know that. And the thing is that, and yet at the same, and that actually is a genocidal impulse on display. Now, one of the things that I want to do is I want to read to you from a book that I have. It's called The Image Before the Weapon, A Critical History of the Distinction Between Combatants, combatants and civilians, I think. I'm going to look at the cover. Yeah, The Image Before the Weapon, A Critical History of the Distinction Between Combatant and Civilian. Now, and this is a book by Helen Kinsella, and I think she's associated at the University of Minnesota. And here's a passage from early on in the book. Let me be clear. I do not claim that international humanitarian law outlaws the killing of civilians. That would be a patent misreading of the law. Although the principle of distinction is the predicate of the potential protection of civilians, it is not an obligation of absolute protection. Instead, it confers responsibility on military commanders and their forces, as well as on civilians in positions of authority, to refrain from directly attacking civilians and civilian objects, to take responsible precautions to avoid and minimize civilian deaths, and to avoid and minimize the destruction of civilian property and the objects necessary to civilian survival. Hamas attacked civilians. They violated everything that was described in the paragraphs that I just read to you. And the Israelis, historically, and what they've done during the recent fighting, was to essentially warn people of the impending attacks and ask them to get out of the way. Okay? And yes, in fact, civilians have died as a result of the military Israeli use of force. But essentially, this war was started by Hamas. Okay? And there was no way to basically disarm and defeat Hamas without bringing about civilian casualties. That's one of the sad realities of warfare in the modern era. Okay? And we all know that Hamas leaders have basically did this to cause civilian casualties. And the problem is that the American left has sided with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran in this most recent war. These people are retrograde, anti-modernist ideologues. And what is the American left doing siding with this? And so anybody that sides with this, and to the extent that I can get you to side with Hamas and portray them as innocent victims and the Israelis as uniquely blameworthy, you should be ashamed of yourself. Okay? October 7th was done to put Jews back in their place the same way that white supremacists tried to put black people in their place in the American South after emancipation. Anyone who cooperates with this process or legitimizes it in the United States or any Western democracy should be ashamed of themselves. So again, I want to thank everybody for watching yesterday's video, and I hope you can help broadcast this one. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.